For anyone who owned a Game Boy Advance, the name Astro Boy will likely conjure up fond memories, where once there was waning interest in the underwear-clad hero, Treasure stepped up and catapulted him into an original story, complete with some of the best platforming on the system. Astro Boy Omega Factor was a great example of handheld gaming done right. Now, Astro Boy on a DS, however, is a completely different story. It's based off the film, which released around the same time and therefore follows its narrative closely. In between these story moments, this is where unfortunately the gameplay begins, with the adventure being split up into a series of levels which each have several acts to overcome. Starting out, you'll notice with the first press of the D-pad that something's terribly wrong. And no, it's not Astro Boy deciding to finally wear some clothes, it's instead the incredibly loose controls that anyone who has ever played a video game with an ice stage will understand what I'm getting at. Except in Astro Boy, it applies to each level, regardless of ice. And when you couple it with Astro's severe lack of abilities, it all adds up and ultimately ruins the game on the whole. Going hand in hand with the gameplay is the presentation, and do not let the artwork on the back of the box fool you. It's pretty clear the devs at least tried to imitate Omega Factor's sprite work, but once you begin playing you'll see just how uninspired the visuals actually are. Each enemy is repeated over and over again, and usually only consists of a couple of frames of animation. The same goes for the levels themselves, which seem nothing more than simple palette swaps the further you make it through the game. And to top it all off, the soundtrack is simply offensive. Astro Boy on a DS will be remembered as nothing but a disappointment. It just isn't a good game, and you'll notice it even if you've never played Omega Factor. It seems that the Duke Nukem series brings upon a curse that renders those who choose to develop it unable to complete it in time. Over the years we've seen many Duke Nukem games enter a limbo-like state, and Critical Mass was no exception. Announced back in 2008, and at one point thought to be cancelled, it eventually saw the light of day, and in what seems like another growing trend for the series, it completely sucked. Dull is the one word to describe it. Sure, on paper you've got all of the pieces of what could be a great game, and in total there's 36 levels, and most of the time it's a horizontal shooter, but the gameplay changes to that of a top-down shooter and even a third-person view. The execution is just shockingly terrible, especially the gunplay that offers literally no tactile feedback, to the point where it feels like you're shooting Nerf darts at the enemy. You can only shoot horizontally in a straight line, and the camera is close to the action, and as a result the enemies you can't see on the screen will be spamming you with gunfire, and trying to hit enemies at different elevations becomes nothing but a chore. In some spots you can take cover behind walls and take out enemies that are on a different plane. However, it doesn't add anything to the gameplay since you become vulnerable to enemies on the main 2D plane whilst doing it. It's a real mess, and to be honest nothing more than a pointless gimmick. Graphically, it appears the developers know all the twists and turns to make a good looking DS game, but the lack of animation and effects in various areas spoil their efforts. John St. John reprises Duke once more, however the writer of the script has failed to capitalize on the talented man. So what we're left with is an iconic voice delivering uninteresting dialogue and one-liners that never score a hit with players. The idea of mixing various gameplay styles was a promising one, but ultimately materialized in the form of a broken game, made by people that shouldn't be allowed to program. The premise behind Bigfoot Collision Course is actually pretty good, and I think that in the right hands, a monster truck kart style racer would actually be quite cool. That's pretty much what this game is going for, with tracks that aren't based on real world locations, but instead stylized versions of levels set in snow, mountains and forests, which are all littered with various destructive elements for trucks to destroy and smash through. The only thing missing, to be honest, is the use of randomly placed items, which would have mixed up gameplay quite nicely. There is a boost to push your giant wheeled 2-ton truck to victory, but actually doing so sees any form of excitement instantly evaporate. The most negative aspect has to be the physics, which just do not seem to exist. It's more like racing on the moon, with the speed seemingly halved, but it really stands out when making a jump. Your truck literally floats for what feels like minutes until it hits the road again. To add to the train wreck, there's not much of a challenge to Collision Course, and you'll likely win every race with ease. There's really not much at all to this game, and there are plenty of DS races titles out there that are more challenging and will hold your interest for a much longer time. It's a pretty lackluster attempt at using the Bigfoot license, and while I don't think it's a horrible idea, it didn't recreate it on any level. Given a bigger budget or a more passionate development team, perhaps something interesting could have come from this. But as it is, Bigfoot Collision Course is a pretty lame excuse for an arcade kart racer. Even if you're a Bigfoot fan, you'll be disappointed to find that this game doesn't really do anything to capture the Bigfoot spirit, and is more of a simple racing game featuring cars with big tires than nothing else. Releasing around the same time as the film of 2006, Superman Returns managed to tick each and every box when it comes to cheaply produced cash grabs that run off the hype of the public conversation. The developers decided to challenge themselves by making a Superman game in full 3D, with each mission seeing the player roaming a cornered off region of Metropolis that's presented as a maze-like grid filled with jutting polygonal blocks that are supposedly buildings. There is a slight hint of strategy involved as you plot Superman's path towards areas of absolute panic. Once you've reached your destination, the mission starts, and there's about 10 different ones in all, along with variations to provide some artificial bulk. In each mission you only have one objective, and this is nicely complemented by the game only allowing you to perform the abilities which are vital for completion. You don't get to use X-ray vision or other powers unless the game says you can, which isn't very often. The missions are all short and easy to finish once you're accustomed to how they work. You've got a pretty good sense of speed as you jet around the place, but the archaic level design doesn't allow for any freedom whatsoever. The disjointed nature of the game may give you the impression of a collection of minigames just tied together by a rough plot. There were so many things they could have done with this one. The ideas were there, but the execution couldn't have gone worse. Oh well, hopefully one day we will eventually get a decent Superman game, but I just can't see it happening as each one I've played feels like nothing more than a curse. Pokemon Dash deviates from the traditional Pokemon RPG format that fans of the series actually want, and instead presents us with a racing game. Not a kart racing game though, an on-foot racing game, with the basic goal being to race from point A to point B across a series of about 5 different obstacles such as lava or water. That's it. That's the entire game. Pokemon Dash quite possibly has the least story of any Pokemon entry as well. Tetris had a better story than this. There's no reason why you're racing, or why you're controlling Pikachu and no other Pokemon, or why you have access to hot air balloons. I know that the other Pokemon games aren't going to be made into books anytime soon, but this is just lazy. Of course the gameplay doesn't fare any better with it all revolving around the stylus, so you basically have to keep up with a bunch of other slow, unwieldy Pokemon, rubbing a screen with a stylus and risking damage to it. The sad thing is that this game relies on possibly the most violent rubber band AI I've ever seen. If you pull into the lead, your opponents will not only suddenly catch up to you, they'll rock ahead of you on later tracks and reach the finish line leaving you in the dust. If you think the races in the F-Zero series were violent, the enemy Pokemon in this game are as evil as the Hounds of Hell, and will go so far as to go out of their way to push you into lava or some other hazard. Graphics here are your typical 64-bit visuals. Everything from grass to water to the roads, it just looks so fuzzy. And from the hot air balloons, it's even worse, even though it was the first game to brandish the Pokemon logo on the DS. Pokemon Dash will forever be a game that will appeal to those that have absolutely no prior knowledge of it beforehand. If you see it on the cheap, do the world a favour, buy it and destroy it. If there's one game on the DS that's not even worth the plastic it's printed on, it has to be Homie Rollers. The characters alone will make you want to headbutt the nearest wall, with them all playing off Latino stereotypes, and any further discussion will likely get this video zapped. Suffice to say, it's not the most flattering portrayal. But let's get into how Homie Rollers plays in comparison to some of the other kart titles out there, like Mario Kart or Crash Team Racing. What you need to do is take out everything in those games that makes them fun, leave only 10 tracks and erase every mode other than single race, and then you have Homie Rollers. The only thing you do is pick one of 10 characters and race through 10 tracks in a row. The main problem is the difficulty though, as the game requires you to come in first in order to advance, and unfortunately it's going to take you dozens of tries just to get out of last place. To add to the pain, when you finally do start to inch close to first place, somebody will almost always use a power up that sends you right back to last place. You would think that programming a kart racer's controls would be second nature. After all, there are literally dozens of examples of the genre, but homie rollers can't even get that right. The steering in the game is so touchy that you'll be convinced that your character is simply drunk. Too often you'll find yourself accidentally missing shortcuts or running right into a wall. Worse yet, the levels throw out all sorts of obstacles that are nearly impossible for you to dodge using the oversensitive controls. Homie Rollers is an absolutely worthless kart racer that has obviously been given the absolute minimum amount of effort. Add on the hilariously awful artwork and the game almost seems like a cruel joke. I honestly did try to squeeze some positives out of the game. There are none. It's like trying to make rocks bleed. 2011 saw the rebirth of the classic 80s franchise Thundercats, with a new cartoon hitting our TV screens. To go along with the series, it was announced that a new game, something that hadn't happened since the 80s as well, would be making its way to the DS. Hyped was an understatement, as here we had what seemed to be a pretty action-packed side-scroller, featuring everyone's favourite anthropomorphic cat battling an evil mummy, just like the good old days. But upon playing the game, it quickly becomes clear that so many corners were cut that the literal essence of what made Thundercats so great is nowhere to be seen. For starters, the visuals, and if I'm being honest, this would even look subpar on a Game Boy Advance. Each character is a vague group of colours stitched together to hopefully resemble their likeness, with each enemy actually faring a bit better, but they're all surrounded by ugly red outlines, making them look like crude paper cutouts against the background. Animations and effects are also just as uninspired, resulting in a gameplay experience that comes across as stiff and at times extremely awkward. Combat is mind-numbingly simple. Tapping the attack button performs a multi-hit combo that you'll use over and over again. You can perform a jump attack, slam attack, and charge attack as well. However, these are rarely useful thanks to long-range enemies that are deadly accurate. One of the biggest flaws in the game is that you can only play as Lion-O. The other cats are in the game, but only as assist characters. This was a huge misstep in my eyes, and including them all with separate abilities or stats would have been the perfect way to mix up the gameplay. But as it stands, Thundercats is just a mundane slog of a game that gets held back by its lack of ideas and over-dependence on its license. I figured it had a good chance of being one of the rare licensed games that actually capture the magic of the source material, but boy, I was wrong. Save yourself the trouble and leave this one where it belongs, in the gutter. First off, let me make it clear that I am a huge fan of the Luna series, and I've been in love with it ever since I got the original game for the Sega CD. But what the hell is this? And whose idea was it to tie HP of all things to movement in an RPG? Let me start by saying that Luna Dragon Song has no redeeming factors. The story for one is so cliched that you'll probably take it as an insult that this shit has the series logo on its box. I just cannot begin to fathom how this game ever got made. There are red flags everywhere, with the most prominent being the gameplay. Any game that makes your health drop just while you're running around already has a very bad point going against it. There are some things about games that are assumed, trivial things like your characters probably going to the bathroom, washing themselves, and all of them sleeping 6 to 8 hours a day, despite the fact that you occasionally drop by an inn for help. If you had to keep track of all of these little details yourself, you'd never get anything else done, or you'd be playing The Sims. So why does a game developer ever think it's necessary to burden the player with diminishing health, just running around a town or a forest? The battles themselves fare no better, like seriously, to the point you'd likely fall asleep if it weren't for you having to occasionally press a button. As if this wasn't bad enough, monsters can steal and break your equipment, and the feeling of losing a weapon is something I don't wish upon anyone, as nearly everything in the game is so damn expensive. Oh, but it gets worse. You don't get money, items, and experience fighting monsters. No. That would make way too much sense. You can fight for items or experience, but not both. Why? Who knows? Maybe the prick who designed the movement system. When it comes down to it, if you value your time on this earth, then stay well away from this poor excuse of a game. Believe me, there are so many solid RPGs on the DS that are worth your time over this. If you think that SNK vs Capcom Kart Fighters is some kind of watered down handheld version of Capcom vs SNK, then don't get your hopes up. This game doesn't have any 2D fighting whatsoever, as it's a competitive card title along the lines of Yu-Gi-Oh! Or the Pokemon trading card game. The original on the Neo Geo Pocket was one of my favourite titles on that system, and before Card Fighters released, I was excited to see how it would all be updated. Well, it was both a blessing and a curse, because while it's a fun card battling swashbuckling game that makes great use of the large body of Capcom and SNK source material, it doesn't handle the transition to the DS well at all. First off, the translation is extremely lacking, with many of the cards' descriptions not even making one lick of sense. For a game centered around the use of them, the fact that most aren't even legible felt like a huge slap in the face for longtime fans. And it's a shame really, it's sad to see one of the most popular handheld games of its time be devolved into this poor excuse of a game. But here's the worst part. There is one game-breaking glitch that totally renders Card Fighters DS nearly unplayable for completionists. In the second playthrough on the 9th floor, there is a character you battle that will simply freeze your game. Considering there are 21 floors in all, that's a good bit of game missing. This means you will not be able to collect all of the cards without some sort of cheating device, but it seems like it was the customer that was cheated with this one. Obviously not everyone who plays it will run into it, but the fact that it's there and that it was never rectified in the American release is yet again another huge slap in the face, which at this point literally turns into a combo the more you play, with each and every misstep severely hurting the game. I tried so hard to like Card Fighters DS, but I feel it's a good card game stuck inside a bad video game. I say use the money you might have spent on this and try to dig up a Neo Geo Pocket with Card Fighters Clash, or even the modern re-release on the Switch, which delivers what this game was meant to. Arcade Attack is a side-scrolling beat-em-up, much like so many Ninja Turtle games before it. In a throwback to the classics, Ubisoft decided to replicate the classic arcade gameplay without really understanding what made those games so good to play in the first place. There are 8 rather short stages, which are all equally unbearable to make your way through. You start off picking one of the 4 turtles, each with apparently different stats, but there's no noticeable difference in their speed, damage, or overall technique, other than just having different weapons. You can also choose a character, basically an AI punching bag that at least tries to help you beat up on enemies, but its real value of being there is nothing more than a gimmick, especially when the game is so easy to beat. The gameplay works in a similar fashion to the earlier games in the series, with each stage being broken up into different areas and seeing you travel from one area to the next, all the while defeating waves of enemies that appear on the screen. Rinse and repeat until the end of the stage. Sometimes a boss will await you, but boss or no boss, there is no challenge whatsoever, and this is where the game fundamentally fails. It doesn't help that the controls are severely limited. You've got a hit, kick, block, and jump button, but with no combos to speak of, other than a jump combo that isn't exactly the easiest thing to pull off thanks to the way the buttons have been assigned. It soon becomes nothing but a chore to play, and nothing but a shadow of what the original arcade classics brought to the table. Overall, a bunch of major missteps keep Arcade Attack from not only delivering the arcade nostalgia Ubisoft had hoped for, but any semblance of entertainment at all. Well, that does it for today's video. Keep an eye out for part 2, as that will be coming up soon. So don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell to get notified about new videos. You can follow me on all of the socials, which are linked below, to stay up to date, and also join my growing community on Discord to meet many like-minded gamers to continue the conversation with. I'd like to give a special shout out to my Patreon supporters: Rhino, Skill Jim, Shuden, Richard, Amy, Daniel, Paul, Theo, Omar, Strider, Pierre, Carl, Awesome Jacket Dude, GameCube Galaxy, Cursed Salaryman, and Paddy J for their continued support that helps make these videos possible. If you're interested in joining my Discord or supporting the channel through Patreon, you'll find all of these links down below. As always, thanks for taking the time to watch the video. I'll catch you next time.